For those who remember the 2000 Olympic Games, which were held in Australia in Sydney, it was just such a wonderful, mammoth event held at that time, a celebration of a sport, but also a celebration of Australian culture. But one of the very unique endings that happened at that Olympic Games was the final celebration and fireworks. The fireworks were held around Sydney Harbour, and as the fireworks display went off on this mammoth scale on TV for billions of people to watch happen live, the word eternity suddenly emblazoned itself across Sydney Harbour. For people all around the world looking at this word appear on Sydney Harbour, they may have thought, well, the word's probably up there because it's the year 2000 and it's the turn of the new millennium. But for the people of Sydney who were there, they saw that word appear and people cheered because they knew there was another story behind that word which really only the Sydney-siders would have known about. It goes right back to the early 1930s. A shadowy figure emerged one particular morning, around about 4 a.m, into the streets of Sydney in the complete darkness with only the street lamps lighting certain parts of the street. And this shadowy figure, dressed in a suit and a hat, walked along the footpath. He stopped in the darkness, looked left and right to see if there was no one else around, and then he bent down on one knee and took a piece of chalk out of his pocket and wrote a single word onto the pavement. And the word was eternity. And it was written in a very specific copperplate style of writing. This shadowy figure, a man of very short stature, would emerge out of his bed at 4 a.m. each morning for the next 35 years and would walk through the streets of Sydney writing down this word eternity. It's estimated he wrote it nearly 500,000 times. It was a great mystery to the Sydney-siders because they were getting out of bed during the 1930s and 40s and 50s, seeing this word suddenly appear on the streets and the pavements and the walls, but they had no idea who was putting it there. It wasn't until the 1950s where this particular man was suddenly spotted by accident in an alleyway with a piece of chalk writing the word eternity on the pavement. And the person who spotted him actually knew him. His name was Arthur Stace. Now, Arthur Stace was a former World War I soldier. He had had a very sad and a very bad upbringing. Came back from the war, now deeply traumatized. He turned to alcohol. He became a petty criminal and a chronic gambler. His life was really a complete mess. In his own words, he said, "I have become a very bad man." But it was one night during the 1930s, he attended a church service, one he was invited to go to simply because at the end of the service they offered food, which he needed that night. But during the service, he heard the message of Christ. And as he listened to the promise Jesus had to restore people's lives, not just in this life, but also give them the hope for a future that goes beyond the grave, it transformed him. And Arthur Stace went out to a tree, a very large tree not far away, and he stood under that tree that night and he said, "I want to give my heart to you, Jesus." And he talked about that being a transforming event for him. He started to overcome the alcohol, the criminal activity, and the gambling, and his life started to come together. A few years later, he felt on one particular night service that God put a word on his heart, which is the word eternity. And he had a calling from God to go around the streets of Sydney and write this word eternity onto all the pavements, on the walls, everywhere he could. So when the Sydney-siders would arise in the morning to go to work and school, eternity would be present and they would see it constantly. It'd be written on their city. Eternity is a concept that's very, very confronting for our culture. It's extremely confronting for our culture because it requires us to deal with a subject no one wants to talk about. And the subject is death. Death is such a confronting issue for us that we almost want to turn our eyes away from it when we see it. We don't want to talk about it or discuss it. This year, one of the biggest films that came out was a film called Barbie. Barbie was immensely popular at the box office, but there's a scene in it where Barbie is at a large party, everyone's dancing, she's having fun, everyone's having fun, and then suddenly Barbie, out of nowhere, asks the question, "Do you guys ever think about dying?" And when that happens, the party, bang, abruptly stops. dancing stops, the atmosphere goes flat. Because it's a taboo subject. No one is allowed to ask the question, is there life after death? If there is life after death, is this life going to shape that destiny of what happens afterwards? But these questions are deep, and these questions, I'm afraid, are too deep for a culture that's just too shallow. It's almost as if we're part of this TV series where you see a sci-fi dystopian city set up, and all the people are locked within this city. They can't escape, but they live within the city, go to work during the day, go to schools, go to the parks, go to the cafes. But people at certain times suddenly stand up from what they're doing and they walk right to the middle of the city. And right in the middle of the city is this single small square building with one single door on the front. And the people just walk in through the door and disappear forever. Everyone in the city knows at some point people are walking towards this building and going through this door. But no one is allowed to talk about it. It is a taboo subject. And this is how intimidating death has become for us. There's an intriguing discussion that happens in John chapter 6 between Jesus and his disciples. It comes at a point where Jesus had been immensely popular with crowds. He'd been drawing in thousands and thousands of people, and the disciples must have been really rapt with this because there's nothing better than being popular. But at this point, the crowds have turned from Jesus. They've walked away. It's because they've found his teaching to be simply too hard, whether they can't comprehend it or the expectations are too high a bar, but they've walked. And here's this moment where the disciples are standing there quite stunned that their popularity has disappeared, and there's Jesus, and they're wondering now what's going on here. And Jesus, hearing the insecurity almost on the hearts of the disciples, turns to them and he says, "Are you guys going to walk away as well?" And it's Peter who turns back to Jesus and he says, "Where else will we go? Only you have the words of eternal life." You see, when Jesus spoke about eternity, he didn't speak as opinion, he spoke as fact, as if he himself had full knowledge of what was behind that door of death. He knew everything about eternity. And Christ talked about eternity as truth and something that he was in charge of. So when Christ promises the disciples that when he dies, he will resurrect back to life, sure enough, when the time came, when Jesus died on the cross, he walked through that door of death. But 3 days later, he does the absolute unthinkable. At the resurrection, he walks back through the door and comes back into life. Something that they had not seen before. Something that was not going on in this world. This dystopian future had now been broken apart by discovery that you can be resurrected. And Jesus says to the disciples at his resurrection, and he says to the hundreds of people he speaks to, that he now is in charge of death. He is now in charge of life beyond death. He is now in charge of the future, and he can take the very essence of every human being, that is that eternal dimension, our spiritual side. He can now resurrect that person one day back into a new kingdom, a new life and a new hope. Therefore, you don't need to pin all your hopes and dreams on what's going on right now. It's what's going to happen beyond death that matters. Eternity has now been written not just on the footsteps of Sydney, but now has been written on the hearts of every human being. It was during the 1960s in Sydney that the Sydney Council made the decision to restore the General Post Office in town. It had fallen into some disrepair, so it needed to be spruced up a bit. As part of the finishing touches, the clock tower needed to have the bell replaced back into it. Now, the bell had been in storage for about 20 years. So the bell was brought out of storage, it was unwrapped and taken up to the very top of the clock tower. And as the workmen hung this bell up, one of the workmen looked inside the bell and spotted something. He saw, written in yellow chalk in copperplate style, was the word eternity. As Arthur Stace had already passed away, they have no idea how Arthur Stace got into this bell and wrote that word. And that remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of Sydney. And maybe we'll never know. Or maybe we have all eternity to find out.